Thank you, everyone. Thank you especially to everyone at the Belvedere Museum for all of your work pulling this together. And thank you to my fellow panelists and also to the other presenters that we heard yesterday. And I'm sure that we'll hear for the rest of the week. This has been enormously generative and just a really nice space to just reflect on these questions. So I think it's safe to say that most of us are here today because on some level or another, we're extremely aware of all of these shifts happening in the digital cultural heritage sphere, as accentuated by the needs and changes happening in the pandemic. As we've seen in the presentation so far, while the pandemic didn't instigate this shift to digital in museums, it definitely increased the need for the perceived value of and the use of a shared language around the importance of digital presence for museums. So social media campaigns, robust website collections, virtual exhibitions, physical objects, of born digital objects, the creation of touch-free interactives that are especially engaging. So today I want to acknowledge this digital explosion by asking us to pause for a minute and maybe take a theoretical step back and think about what we mean by digital cultural heritage. We could talk all day about this concept and all of its manifestations and permutations and iterations, but I want to talk specifically about what this question means when it comes to creating interactive experiences with cultural artifacts, partly because I think most of us here are predisposed to think about meaning through objects. I want to talk specifically about the fact that we often conflate this question of what does it mean to think digitally about creating interactive experiences with cultural artifacts as how do we use a given tool or technology to present an artifact most authentically, which I think is built on some problematic assumptions. It's built on this idea of what I'm calling in this presentation tool centricity, the tendency to think first about the technology we're going to use when trying to decide the best way to engage an audience. The tendency to look first at the tools, technologies like AR applications, VR spaces, whatever it is when deciding how to create and share a narrative around an artifact. I think this approach is potentially problematic for several reasons. And here are sort of the main categories that I group those problems into. I think this approach reinscribes hierarchies and binary assumptions embedded in a given tool or technology. And in doing so, it reinforces linearity in the process. It also limits interpretation, interaction, and innovation by predetermining its end product and disguising narrative ambiguities that don't fit that tool. It also conflates sharing a new format with sharing new insight instead of privileging an audience's ability to find and create insight on their own. And so today I'd like to also, in the process of critiquing this approach, propose an alternative that I'm calling digital ekphrasis or ekphrasis, we're going to say ekphrasis today, which is characterized by an approach that sees digital cultural heritage not primarily as the process of encoding objects with machines, but as presenting human culture and its artifacts as dynamic, fluid, and connected. It sees the undertaking of creating a digital exhibit as fundamentally interpretive and expressive. It sees the task of any digital exhibit as creating space for users to decide things for themselves. So this model is actually a very old one at core. I'm asking that we move beyond mimicry when creating digital objects to find the digital within the analog. So in order to talk about this, I'm going to take what may seem initially as this hard left turn and talk about Emily Dickinson, but I promise it will all connect in the end. So I want to talk a bit about the fraught cultural history of Emily Dickinson's poems at the hands of well-meaning friends, family, editors, publishers, who I argue missed her poems' potential and in the way that they were thinking first about the tools that they would use to give her poems an audience. So if you are unfamiliar with Dickinson's work, Emily Dickinson wrote almost 1,800 poems in her lifetime. In contrast to the prevailing articulation of her at one point, thankfully not as popular recently, presenting Dickinson as a recluse who is disconnected from the world around her. She actually used her poems, which were often written on the backs of receipts, envelopes, scraps of paper, to cultivate, preserve, and participate in rich social networks in the town where she lived. Within this kind of framework, Dickinson's poems created and perpetuated a web of local publication with an audience of individuals that she singled out and approached personally, sending them poems as these small folded objects that she stuck in the bottom of other letters, that she tied to bouquets that she sent them from her garden. They were meant to be read privately. Some were also meant to be read in small groups. So these poems were anything but private on some level, at least private to Dickinson. But when it came to traditional publishing, which was going through a boom in the mid-19th century, Dickinson was not interested. She told an editor with whom she corresponded that she smiled when he suggested that she delays to publish, since publishing is as foreign to her thought as firmament to fame. If fame belonged to me, I could not escape her, she said. She actually wrote a poem about publishing where she said that publication is the auction of the mind of man, that poverty is justifying for so foul a thing. So it's probably not surprising, given these reactions, that Dickinson only published 10 poems and 1 letter in her lifetime. Some of these, it's argued, may not have even been printed with her permission, since they are present without attribution in newspapers. In the newspapers, they were incredibly standardized according to Victorian print conventions and the needs of the print technology at the time. So when Dickinson died in 1886, she left directives to her younger sister, Lavinia, telling her to destroy all of her papers, which Lavinia did with a promptness she later deplored, it was said. Thankfully for the rest of us, Lavinia interpreted Dickinson's directive to mean only destroying her letters, diaries, that kind of thing. Because in the process, she discovered in the trunk of a maid for the Dickinsons, the 1,800 poems. Some of them were loose, some were sort of carefully copied out into hand-sewn booklets. The process of this discovery, though, set off a family tug-of-war, and that prevented any meaningful full collection of the poems being published for several decades. We could have an entire presentation about the Dickinson family dynamics, but suffice it to say that Emily Dickinson's brother's wife and his, let's call her his girlfriend, had different ideas about what to do with the poems, who should own the copyright, all of that fun stuff. So when Lavinia first made the discovery of the poems, she asked Susan Dickinson, or Sue, who during Emily's lifetime was her sort of informal editor, her friend, It is very convincingly argued that Sue was also someone with whom she was in a romantic relationship as well. So Lavinia handed her these poems and said, we have to get these published. But for one reason or another, Sue was not quickly successful in that. And so Mabel, Mabel Loomis Todd, asked if she could try her hand at it. Her method was interesting for the time. So this was in the 1880s. Typewriters had been around for a decade or two, but were just becoming accessible as a technology to own in the home. So Mabel decided to first copy out the poems by hand and then type them out on what was called an index typewriter, which is as painstaking to use as you might think, given that the individual using one had to sort of slide this, this lever around and one by one select the letters and punctuation that they were trying to type out. So as a result of all of this conflict, the poems, and also just sort of the poems' unique structure, their popularity grew very slowly in the decades after Dickinson's death, which resulted in a great number of print collections and eventually in digitized collections that were all built on the same assumptions. The idea that the poems need to be brought into some kind of conformity with the expectations and limitations of the print technology available, even as much as certain editions try to resist that. So as you can see here, we have this enormous list, everything from poems printed just a few years after Dickinson died through publications in the 80s and the 90s, which all took advantage of different types of technology available. For instance, the Franklin editions of the books showed full facsimiles for the first time. They printed in black and white, but they were able to show the poems as these manuscripts in a public sense for the first time. You also get what I find interesting, which is the reading edition of the poems, which makes me wonder why the others were not reading editions. The point being, these collections assumed that the poems were somewhat static objects, that their goal was to provide access, not interactivity, not experience of the poems. So looking at a particular poem in this, according to this mindset, this is probably how you're used to seeing Dickinson poems if you are any kind of Dickinson connoisseur. It looks pretty standard. You know, you have the 4 stanzas, you have expected punctuation. This is commonly the way you would see Dickinson printed in all but a couple of more academic anthologies. The problem is the poems Dickinson wrote actually looked more like this. So if you look carefully and at the sort of translation or transcription of her handwriting has been typed out here to make it a little easier to read. If you look closely, you'll see that certain words have been marked out. There are plus signs in line that next to words that correspond to alternative words in the margin. So there's a lot of indecision here. But when the poems were published, the editors essentially just picked one option in line in order to create a more sort of expected presentation. In fact, one of Dickinson's family members described how the process of creating the print editions of these poems was frustrating. She said that tiny crosses written beside a word might be changed ultimately, and which referred to scores of possible words at the bottom of the page. for all exactly alike, so that only the most sympathetic and at one with the author individual could determine where each word belonged. These editors and publishers were primarily concerned with how they're going to render the objects in print in order to get them to a wider audience. They were asking a version of the question I talked about earlier, which is, how do we use the tool or technology given to us to present Dickinson's poems most authentically? And to a point, this is understandable. I mean, the print technology of the 19th, early 20th centuries was still evolving. The expectations around what a poem was were, shifting dramatically. So it was inevitable that print editions were confined to heavy-handedness. But considering first the needs of technology not only created these artificially flat or static representations of Dickinson's body of work for reading audiences, but it also created some other problems. It presented the act of bringing the poems into cultural consciousness as primarily an act of binary translation, a shift from manuscript to print or back, from print to digital. It encouraged the belief that any one printed version of her work was the true or authentic version. It also masked Dickinson's mode of direct address to her readers and the way that she invited them to get inside of her work. But when I look at these poems, I can't help thinking that this question of, what's the right or the best or the most authentic way to render these poems, these manuscripts into print or as data, I think that's the wrong one. I think these poems' directness, undecidedness, nonlinearity was never going to succeed very well in print at all, or in digital collection built from the same assumptions. I think this is the wrong question again. I see poems that are experimental, fluid, evasive, and slippery, that invite interaction and interpretation. And I'm not the only one. Poet Susan Howe talks about how Dickinson's later work often demonstrates that it can embrace contingency while capturing a moment before the instant of its writing. She says that Dickinson's poems are suggestive, not static. Critic Virginia Jackson states that Dickinson's writing often invites or assumes a reader other than its often unavailable or out of reach historical addressee, and other than an imaginary or sympathetic eavesdropper or theatrical audience in the distant future. So when I look at these poems, I see something different. I see their connectedness. I decided to try and map out what I see as these points of indecision and interactivity in these poems. I started circling the words with alternates in the margins or the sides. I tried to connect them. And in the process, I noticed I'm seeing analog poems that are, to me, intrinsically digital, fluid, connected to themselves, always in flux. And I should clarify, when I'm talking about incentricity, I'm not talking about their essence, their sort of true nature. I'm talking about incentricity in the way that a bone is intrinsic to a leg. It's predicated on, entirely contained within the analog. I think the poems invite an approach to building digital interactive objects that's grounded in what I call here digital ekphrasis, an interpretive approach that looks for the digital within the analog, the moments where an artifact invites interaction impossible in traditional materials, and treat digital tools as a way to express it, allowing the artifact to become a site of interactive meaning and exchange. This concept is building on the more traditional understanding of ekphrasis, which is a literary description of or commentary on a visual work of art. not just a catalog of what's in the work of art. It's actually an interpretive expression in its own right that looks at the work of art as a dynamic object to explore. For example, you may have read Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, where he's describing the scene on the urn, its sort of kinetic qualities. Another a popular example is in the Iliad, when Homer provides a long and discursive account of what's happening in the scenes on Achilles' shield. This digital ekphrastic approach sees digital cultural heritage not primarily as just encoding objects with machines, but as presenting human culture and its artifacts as dynamic, fluid, and connected. Again, it embraces the contradiction in any act of interpretation and encourages audiences to get close and participate in the process of meaning making. When it comes to Dickinson, I am still working out what this looks like exactly. If print is not perhaps exposing all of the fluidity and potential, this kinetic quality of these poems, I think digital is poised to do so. So I created a prototype site that allows readers to interact with these slippery points in the poem. If you look closely here, you'll see that one of the words that had a plus sign next to it in the manuscript is now a clickable interactive object, so that readers can go in, create their own poem through the pieces that Dickinson provides, interact, interpret, to think about the way that, describing the act of loving another person as an expanse versus an extent, entirely different ways of characterizing relationships. Speaking more generally about what this means for digital cultural heritage that is not poems, that is not literature, this approach asks us to read out of an artifact and not into it, to find the story embedded in its particulars and histories without trying to impose a given binary or narrative. It asks us to look closely at the object being displayed and asks where there's contradiction or irresolution. It also asks us to focus our work and the audience's interactions on interpretation, not on translation or mimicry. It hopefully returns us to one of the sort of original roots of the term technology, which is a discourse or treatise on an art or the arts, from a Greek word meaning systematic treatment of an art, craft, or technique, with the origins of words for art, skill, craft, method, system, a system of making or doing. So instead of this question of how do we use a given tool or technology to present an artifact most authentically, I think we should be asking a much simpler question to begin with. We should be asking, what is this artifact trying to say? Thank you.